At around 2 a.m., the tactical situation in the Donetsk region, specifically at the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya junction, reached a critical inflection point. Following weeks of intense pressure, Russian Federation forces had achieved notable, albeit localized, successes. In the Pokrovsk operational direction, Russian units had secured approximately 5 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. This gain was not a broad, consolidated front, but rather a narrow salient, formed through a series of small-scale infiltrations by infantry groups advancing along tree lines and field tracks, primarily under the cover of darkness. Having established this foothold, Russian engineering units began the process of consolidation, constructing trench networks, forward command posts, and ammunition depots to support further offensive operations. Similarly, on the Dobropilya axis, Russian forces had executed a comparable strategy earlier in August, seizing a larger area of approximately 13.5 square kilometers. This captured territory formed a distinct pocket, encompassing several key road junctions and forested strips between agricultural fields, which provided critical cover and concealment. The initial Russian strategy appeared successful, leveraging tank bombardments to weaken Ukrainian defensive lines and create openings for these infantry-led infiltrations. The commander-in-chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, confirmed these initial territorial losses, acknowledging the tactical challenge posed by Russia's persistent, small group assaults. However, the Ukrainian General Staff initiated a coordinated and systematic counteroffensive designed not merely to halt the Russian advance, but to reverse it and reclaim strategically valuable terrain. The Ukrainian operational plan was not predicated on a single, large-scale assault. Instead, it was a meticulously planned sequence of smaller, rapid, and interconnected maneuvers focused on degrading Russian logistical capabilities, isolating their forward elements, and exploiting the inherent vulnerabilities of their newly formed salients. The first phase of the Ukrainian counteroperation commenced in the Pokrovsk sector. At approximately 4:30 a.m., Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, began systematic reconnaissance missions over Russian rear areas. Their primary objective was to identify and mark logistical convoys, fuel trucks, and command vehicles moving toward the front line. Subsequently, Ukrainian medium-range artillery and rocket systems began intermittent, precision strikes on these designated targets. The goal was to establish a fire lock on the primary supply and retreat routes servicing the Russian salient. By mid-morning, this strategy intensified. Over the subsequent days, Ukrainian forces deployed M142 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS, to interdict Russian military convoys with precision-guided munitions. According to Ukrainian military reports, between 1 and 3 separate Russian convoys were struck by guided rockets each day. These convoys, often containing T-series main battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles intended to reinforce the forward positions, became primary targets. Concurrently, waves of first-person view FPV kamikaze drones were deployed, creating a persistent aerial threat that effectively interdicted Russian movement into the Pokrovsk area. This combined arms approach systematically eroded Russia's ability to supply and reinforce its forward units, leading to daily casualty rates reportedly exceeding 100 personnel. With the logistical and reinforcement channels severely degraded, Ukrainian ground forces began the next phase, the systematic clearing of Russian positions. This was not a frontal assault, but a series of flanking maneuvers. Ukrainian units operating in small, agile teams identified the teeth marks, the small protrusions created by the initial Russian advance, and applied pressure from the flanks to narrow and isolate them. As soon as an artillery barrage lifted, infantry teams would execute short, rapid advances, or jumps, into targeted buildings and trench lines. Instead of establishing fixed, static positions, they employed flexible patrols and established small, mobile defensive pockets, prepared to withdraw if necessary. This fluid tactical posture made it difficult for Russian forces to mount effective counterattacks on the same day. Following the clearance of a position, Ukrainian combat engineers would immediately begin sweeping for mines and improvised explosive devices, IEDs, securing the area throughout the night. This methodical, rhythm-disrupting strategy reversed the initial Russian gains within a week. The Ukrainian command announced the liberation of over 26 square kilometers in the Pokrovsk sector alone, more than 5 times the territory initially lost. Crucially, the recaptured terrain included small elevations, critical road junctions, and ridges suitable for forward observation, granting Ukrainian defenders superior visibility and more advantageous firing angles for repelling future assaults. Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi later elaborated on this success, highlighting 2 key principles. First, he acknowledged that while Russian infiltrations were initially effective, their reliance on narrow corridors like tree lines made them exposed targets at dawn. Ukraine countered these multiple small arrows of attack, not with one large arrow, but with a similar methodology characterized by superior fire discipline and coordination. Second, he emphasized the speed of the Ukrainian response, stating that moves to compensate for losses were executed within hours or a day, preventing small Russian protrusions from consolidating and expanding. A similar and reportedly harsher application of this doctrine unfolded on the Dobropilya axis. Following the Russian capture of a 13.5 square kilometer pocket in early August, Ukrainian forces initiated their counter-operation. They systematically squeezed the pocket from both sides, established a firelock on the main withdrawal route, and then cleared the isolated Russian forces from the interior. After systematically sweeping the area for ordnance, defense pockets were established. The outcome was a striking reversal. Ukrainian forces announced the recapture of 25.5 square kilometers. As in Pokrovsk, the reclaimed territory was not just empty land. It included nodes connecting small elevations and secondary supply routes, fundamentally improving the Ukrainian defensive posture. By the end of the month-long period of operations, the combined results from both axes were significant. Ukraine announced the liberation of more than 58 square kilometers of territory. This total included numerous small settlements and critical terrain thresholds that enhanced the security of the overall defense line. During this same period, Russian offensive actions remained high. Ukrainian sources reported repelling over 350 separate Russian attacks in the Pokrovsk direction alone. However, these attacks were spread horizontally across the front and failed to achieve any significant vertical penetration. The Russian approach of using small groups and reinforcement convoys to establish machine gun nests and mortar positions in the gray zone was consistently thwarted by Ukraine's reconnaissance strike complex. Ukrainian UAVs, particularly those with thermal imaging capabilities, tracked these build-up attempts at night. Before dawn, precision fire would disperse the nascent positions, and follow-up fire would target any rescue or reinforcement attempts. In the first days of September, this proactive defensive strategy transitioned into localized offensive actions. The 425th Assault Regiment, known as Skala, executed operations to clear the villages of Novoalexandrivka and Udachne. These operations involved small armored elements supporting infantry teams, with key buildings targeted for rapid raids, while artillery and UAVs provided overwatch. The clearance was planned on a block-by-block basis to maintain tempo. As soon as a foothold was established, UAVs monitored rear access routes to interdict any Russian reinforcements, ensuring the initial success became permanent. Analysis by the 7th Rapid Response Corps of the Ukrainian Airborne Assault Forces confirmed the Russian intention to expand the gray zone border around Pokrovsk through incremental, nightly entrenchment. The standard Ukrainian response cycle became a 3-day process. On the first night, thermal observation and mini UAVs would identify and mark a new Russian position. On the second day, indirect fire would suppress it, and on the third day, infantry suppression teams would move in to neutralize it permanently. This rapid cycle extinguished Russian attempts at the outset, preventing them from accumulating into a larger threat. Russian command attempted to adapt its tactics, deploying naval infantry units as shock troops in narrow breakouts through mixed urban-rural terrain. While these elite units sometimes achieved short-term momentum at the point of initial contact, their advance was quickly blunted by pre-planned minefields, swarms of FPV drones, and coordinated artillery fire. The limited passages suitable for armored vehicles were heavily mined, and Russian engineering elements tasked with clearing them suffered significant losses early in the assaults. When recovery and withdrawal vehicles also became targets, subsequent waves of the attack often dispersed before making contact. The overarching Russian strategic objective remained the encirclement of Pokrovsk to sever its supply routes, as part of the broader plan to advance on the Pokrovsk-Sloviansk triangle. However, this plan was continually frustrated on the ground. Ukrainian forces prioritized the targeting of small bridges, culverts, and light bridging equipment, creating logistical bottlenecks that slowed the tempo of the Russian offensive. Even a temporary, hour-long disruption to a supply route could expose advancing Russian infantry waves and force a retreat. Despite these tactical setbacks, Russian strategic intent in the region remains unchanged. The concentration of an estimated 700,000 military personnel across occupied Ukraine allows for troop rotation and the transfer of reserves between fronts. However, this large force relies on a long and increasingly fragile supply chain. The necessity of supplying multiple axes of advance around Pokrovsk simultaneously means that logistics must flow through several nodes. When these nodes are under constant UAV surveillance and artillery threat, the window for a successful, large-scale attack narrows significantly. This dynamic has created a tactical environment where rhythm and synchronization are more decisive than sheer numbers. Ukrainian medium-depth targeting of depots, transfer points, and maintenance areas using GMLRS-class ammunition has created logistical disruptions lasting several days. The effectiveness of these strikes is often confirmed by mini UAVs documenting fires and secondary explosions. This rapid, target-shifting approach keeps Russian logistics in a constant state of reaction, preventing them from building the momentum required for a breakthrough. Electronic warfare has become a silent but critical component of this battle. Both sides employ GPS jamming and communications disruption. Ukrainian forces have adapted by using low-altitude UAV flights with terrain masking to maintain reconnaissance capabilities during periods of intense electronic interference.
The incoming UAVs, the remaining drones, and falling wreckage struck 9 locations.
This ensures that the flow of targeting data for indirect fire remains consistent, preventing small Russian protrusions from going undetected and growing into larger threats. The end-of-month balance sheet in the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya sector demonstrates the efficacy of Ukraine's strategy. The liberation of 58 square kilometers was not the result of a single decisive battle, but the aggregate outcome of hundreds of small, rapid, and well-coordinated counterattacks. As the autumn rainy season approaches, terrain conditions will likely further constrain armored mobility, increasing the importance of the UAV artillery kill chain. The tactical situation suggests that, for the Russian Federation, the gateway to Pokrovsk is not an opening door, but a closing window. Hope you get a very important update from this channel. If you want to know more, then subscribe this channel.